Keynote speeches has one major advantage. You can ask questions to which nobody expects you to have the answers. This is the different than concluding remarks, where people expect you to answer the questions. So try to come with some hypothesis about something that we're seeing in the region today, because when you talk about Europe, when you talk about democracy, what comes to my mind was there was a not very famous vice president of the United States who was vice president during the last years of the Cold War. He was not a famous intellectual. His name was Dan Quayle, but he coined a famous phrase. He said, "The future will be better tomorrow." And in a certain way, when people look around, we have the feeling that the future will be better tomorrow. I'm also going to try to stay away from a classical economic arguments and analysis, because this is going to be easier for me seeing the publics. As you know, political scientists, we are now in the business of envying economists all the time. And I remember some years ago making a comment that probably in the history of politics never was a profession so influential with politicians like the economists today. But on this discussion, there was a lady who at this moment was the director of the Max-Planck Institute for the History of Sciences. And she looked at me and said, "You are not exactly right. You forget how important astrologists were." And she said, "And for the same reason. They have a rigorous method, they were good at mathematics, and they were brave enough to predict." So from this point of view, basically, we are neither doing this nor that. So let's start with my first argument is going to be that for many people, basically, the illiberal term in Central and Eastern Europe, which basically was very much marked by what happened in countries like Hungary and Poland, but I'm going to talk, it's go much more beyond this, came as a major surprise. When in 2015, the current Polish government was elected, the editor-in-chief of Gazeta Wyborcza and one of the leading Polish dissidents, Adam Michnik, wrote that sometimes a beautiful girl loses her mind and ends up in a bed with a bastard. The idea was that it was very much perceived as an accident, something that does not need to happen. If you look at the result of the last Hungarian elections, you can decide that the girl has decided to marry the guy. So from this point of view, I do believe we need kind of to have a slightly more serious and rigorous analysis what is happening, and basically not to reduce it simply to a kind of an accident and things happening here and there. Secondly, I'm not going to go very much on the economic part of it, because if you're going just to try to predict what happened in Central and Eastern Europe on the base of the economic performance of these countries, I don't believe that you're going to end up where we're here. It was not easy to predict Mr. Orban's coming to power in 2010 in Hungary as a result of the major crisis, economic crisis, but also crisis of trust. But I do believe it's going to be very difficult to predict the success of the current Polish government, keeping in mind that Poland was the fastest growing economy in the region from the period of 2007-2017, with very low levels of corruption. And basically, also, you cannot talk even of a classical protest vote because law and justice parties have been in power before and has been voted out. So it was not a known value to the Polish voters. So the basic problem is what we're talking about. And here you have two different kind of school of thoughts how to try to reflect on these changes. One is to try to see what is happening in Central and Eastern Europe very much as a crisis of democratization. And the key word for this school is backsliding. I don't like very much the word. It has a very strong religious connotation. Backsliding is when you have a recently converted Christian who went back to his old bad habits. So from this point of view, Central and Eastern Europe, when you see basically backsliding, was that you have a certain societies which went through Europeanization, democratization, but they went back to their bad habits. Nevertheless, they're not denouncing basically being Christians. But in the literature on democratization, of course, this type of a reverse is not totally unpredicted. In 1991, at the moment when everybody was celebrating the end of the Cold War and the global spread of democracy, Samuel Huntington wrote a piece in the Journal of Democracy, it was 1991, which was called the SIRT, Democracy's Third Wave. And he basically made the following argument. He said there were two major waves of democratization historically. One was in the period 1820 to 1920. The other was from 1945 to 1960s. Both of them have been followed by reverse waves. And he said there is no need to believe that this could not happen with the third wave. And he basically gave three arguments what kind of factors can bring this type of a reverse wave. The first, he said, this can be reversed if we're going to see the rise of a non-democratic authoritarian power, which basically shows capacity and strong attractiveness. And I do believe we're seeing this not in the face of Russia, but in the face of China. Russia is an important country. It has totally resurgence on military terms, but I do believe what is very much changing a lot of the perceptions of what is happening in the world is particularly the economic success of China and basically the Chinese model. And the Chinese model, I don't believe it's very easy to be imitated, but outside of Europe, particularly, but also inside of Europe, it was very much the success of China that put under question some of the key assumptions that came after 1989. The second factor that he believed can lead to this type of a reverse wave is political, social, and economic crisis in the United States, perceived as the leading country and the model for the democratic world. And I do believe we're seeing also this, and I don't believe this can be reduced simply to the presidency of Donald Trump. There was a certain type of a problem in the American society, and from this point of view, for sure, the crisis of the American model affected also the attractiveness of liberal democracy as a whole. And thirdly, and this is for me the most interesting part of what he's saying, is he said after every reversed wave, democracy was replaced by historically new form of authoritarianism. You are never coming back where you were. It is a historically new form of authoritarianism. And I'm saying this because I do believe that some of the illiberal democracies that I'm interested to discuss basically are a historically new form of authoritarianism. They are very much historical form of authoritarianism in the framework of democracy. They're basically not challenging the idea of the popular sovereignty. Most of these are kind of electoral autocracies, which basically are based on elections, free, not always fair. So from this point of view, I do believe this is critically important. Also, this school of backsliding was particularly interested on the European Union effect on the democratization. Because when we talk about particularly countries in Central and Eastern Europe who are now members of the European Union, it's not so easily to divorce the process of democratization from the process of European integration. In a certain way, they have been there, and traditionally, the common sense was that the process of Europeanization and the process of European integration, they're beneficial to each other, they're strongly, basically strengthening each other. And to some extent this is true, but there's three other arguments that also should be taken in my view in considerations in order to understand why some of these illiberal governments ended up also as a Eurosceptical governments and very much challenging the European Union. The first is something that is not going to be a surprise for anybody who have been doing type of electoral analysis, is that the very fact that your country is a member of the European Union and that you know that the European Union basically is a guarantor for this bigger democratic framework is increasing the incentives for you to vote for a populist and a radical party if you want to send a signal that you're disappointed with the situation. Because in a certain way, you're taking less risk than in a normal situation. You believe that never things can go really wrong because the European Union is there. So from this point of view, on one level, the European Union very much helped to the consolidation of democracies, but on the other side, the existence of this self-safety valve basically increased the incentives for certain type of disappointment groups and voters in the society to express their disappointment in a much more radical way because they did not basically calculate a major democratic breakdown because of the fact that their countries are in the European Union. And this explains one of the major paradoxes of Central and Eastern Europe. You have in countries like Hungary and Poland voters who are voting for governments which basically openly declared war on Brussels. At the same time, Hungary and Poland, according to the latest opinion polls, are the two public opinions in European Union who has the highest level of satisfaction with the European Union. you have a pro-European publics who are voting for Eurosceptical governments. And I do believe part of this paradox is very much there. The second paradox is the fact that some of these regimes basically are very much preconditioned on anti-European rhetoric and European structural funds. A Hungarian colleague of us recently was joking that you probably don't, but I do because I'm coming from Eastern Europe. We used to know certain things that Lenin has said. So Lenin basically has said that the capitalists are ready to sell you the rope on which they're going to be hanged. So Peter Greco recently said that with the European Union it's worse. They're even not selling, they're just gifting it. And it's very true. In a certain way, basically the money, Poland and Hungary are among the biggest recipients of the European structural funds. And if you're going basically to calculate and to get out the effect of the structural funds, for example, on the Hungarian economy, then the economic growth is going to be less than 2%. So from this point of view, basically also you have a factor and you have political regimes that are benefiting both from anti-European rhetoric but also from the European structural funds. But thirdly, and this is quite important, the very fact that you have new democracies that immediately has become part of a process of European integration that for sure was also connected with certain constraints on the part of the voters, created certain questions about democracy, because European Union, in order to exist as a political union, is taking certain decisions out of the electoral politics. And from this point of view, there is a major difference between Cold War type of Western democracies and European Union democracies today. In the Cold War, what was out of electoral politics was foreign policy. Chancellor Schmidt famously said that our relations with the United States are too important to be left to the voters. At the same time now, particularly in the countries which are part of the Eurozone, what is out of the electoral politics is some of the major macroeconomic politics. Basically, for example, budget deficit and things like this, they're constitutionalized. In a certain way, they're taken out of the electoral politics because otherwise, basically, the vulnerability of the euro is going to increase. But this creates the feeling amongst major voters that they can change governments, but they cannot change policies. And this particular level of frustrations can be seen in some of these European publics. The most interesting, and in a certain way the most scary thing, of the type of the political regimes that emerged as a result of this type of a crisis is that, using the metaphor by American political scientist Kim Lane-Shepele, this is a kind of the emergence of a Franken-state. You remember Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where you have a monster that have been basically assembled by elements of a human. In a certain way, you have liberal regimes that are assembled by elements which are present in different type of liberal democracies. When, for example, Mr. Orban was criticized for his media law, he was right to say that there is not a single part of his media law that does not have a precedent in the legislation of another European Union member state. So from a certain point of view, you have a very interesting constitutional engineering in which you are picking up different type of elements present in different liberal democracies, and on the base, you are basically constructing political regimes that are challenging some of the major elements of liberal democracy, particularly some of the rights of the minorities and the system of the check and balances. And I do believe this is something new, and from this point of view, this is type of regimes that should be studied and not simply criticized. Because I do believe that, strangely enough, for the last years, we don't have much more of a studies how they work, what they work, and what kind of demand basically they're responding to. So in order to try to make the second part of my argument, I do believe that, and this is the second school, and the second school is basically, we're not talking about the crisis of democratization. We're talking about the crisis of liberal democracy. It is a global crisis. What you see in Central and Eastern Europe has its particular characteristics. But at the end of the day, we are facing something that Daniel Roderick very well defined in his globalization paradox, that in a kind of a globalized world, where on one level you have the need for much more deeper economic integration in the global economy. At the same time, you basically have a demand for sovereignty and self-determination, and also democracy is the only game in town. You can maximize only two of these three. You decide, basically, to be sovereign and to integrate in the global economy, but this is going to be at the cost of democracy, and Singapore is a great example of this. You decided basically that for you democracy and sovereignty means much more, but then don't be surprised if some of these regimes are going to end up much more protectionist, something that we're seeing now in the United States and many other parts. Or, like in the European Union, you're trying to combine democratization with integration, but then it is going to be at the cost of sovereignty, and basically they're going to be the idea of the shared sovereignty. I do believe that at the end of the day, Daniel Roderick is right, and what we are seeing is much more general crisis of liberal democracy, also as a result of the existence of a global capitalism, which was not there before. The major technological and communication changes. The big data is changing a lot of things about how societies are governed. But at the same time, I'm going to focus very much on some of the particularities of Central and East European case, because I do believe that they're going to be much more important for us. And from this point of view, I'll try to rethink two or three of the characteristics of the change of 1989, which probably is going to be relevant to what we are seeing today. You remember in 1989 the famous Fukuyama article, not the book, the article on in the national interest, the end of history. And it was a very interesting article, by the way, much more interesting than people who today criticize without reading, because he captured something that was in the air. But the most interesting story is he's talking a lot about movement of capitals. He was talking even more about movement of ideas. He was talking about movement of goods. The only thing that did not move were people. Migration is the word absent from the end of the history article. And this was not by accident. In 1989, neither the collapse of Soviet Union nor the collapse of Yugoslavia were very much in the cards. They were perceived as an unlikely phenomenon. Strangely enough, basically, the dissolution of the Cold War that is going to lead to the dissolution of some of the major states was not something that was basically perceived as most likely developments. But I'm saying this because when people today talk about migration crisis, and particularly I do believe it's going to have a major impact on the European Union, they're really trying to reduce this to the flow of people who came from the Middle East, particularly as a result of the Syria crisis and what happened 2015, 2016. For me, the migration crisis has a much more deeper meaning. First, it's a migration of voters. All over Europe, we see a major migration, particularly of the blue-collar voters from the center-left to the far right. You have a migration of arguments. You have a migration of political identities. And this is where basically I'm going to. So this has to a certain extent some of its roots in the way the vote was reimagined in 1989. Because 1989 was a very strange revolution from the point of view of somebody who is doing traditional work on revolutions. It was nonviolent. It was post-heroic in a way, but was both François Furet from the right and Habermas from the left used to say that this is a revolution that didn't bring any new idea. And even more, this was the revolution that makes out of its virtue not bringing new ideas. Nevertheless, it was a revolution very much shaped by intellectuals. So you have all these intellectual figures, but the key word was normality. We want to be a normal country. We want to have a normal life like in the West. To the extent that one of the leading Polish figures said that the new slogan of the 1989 revolution is liberty, fraternity, normality. I'm trying to make now in front of you some of the analysis of what extent this ideology of normality basically can explain some of the problems that we are facing today. And by the way, the normality was not, first of all, the idea of the normality has two different meanings. Normal can be a normative, what it should be, but the normal is what is most widely spread where you are. So from this point of view, in a place like Bulgaria, it is normal to give bribes, and it is normal not to give bribes. It is normal to give bribes because people are giving bribes. So if you want to success basically in this economic environment, better give a bribe. But it is also normal not to give bribes because basically in the framework of normality that people basically has agreed. But this creates a coordination problem. this basically created the problem of the elite that are losing legitimacy, nevertheless, of what they're doing, because at one and the same time, most of these elites are busy half of the day to take bribes and the second to fight corruption. And this comes out of this type of a global condition. Second part of the idea of the normality is that if normality is the West, then if before the future was some place far away in time, then suddenly future become a geographical place. But if a future is a geographical place, the best way to go to the future is simply to move there. Why to stay basically in Poland and waiting Poland to become like Germany when you can go to Germany? And I'm saying this because one of the very kind of unnoticed effect of the 1989 compared with the previous revolution is the following, and this is one of the central arguments which I want to make in front of you. After every revolution, we see a major demographic disruptions. Some of them are a result of people being killed. All of them basically created a certain type of displacement of people, and a lot of the people are basically crossing the borders. But normally people who are living the revolutionary countries are the defeated people, the enemies of the revolution. It was the white Russians that left the Bolshevik Russia. It was the monarchists that left France after 1789. The paradox of the 1989 is that one of the first people to leave were the liberal-minded people that have been strongly supporting this type of changes. Because for them, there was no any major reasons to stay in their own countries when basically their own countries are moving to the West, and the very transition was perceived as a migration. Migration from the East to the West, individual or collectively by countries, and European integration was the result of it. This explains one of the interesting story of the post-1989 development. You have a liberal revolution. We did not devour its children, but you have a children that run out of this revolution. And keep in mind, the number of the people who moved from Eastern Europe to Western Europe as a result of the economic crisis from 2009-2010 is the higher than the people that came from the Middle East. So I'm saying this because this is a structural problem, and this structural problem first explains a kind of a missing liberals and missing youth in many of these countries, and particularly keeping the demographic situation of these countries. And I do believe this is going to explain also part of what some of these governments, which we're going to talk about, are doing. But secondly, this is critically important. Because unlike most of the people who believe that the major crisis in Eastern Europe was simply the fear of migrants, I'm going to claim that the major effect and the reaction of East Europeans to the migration crisis was the delayed impact of emigration. There was a study being done in Germany on the vote of the last elections that shows that the number of the people that left certain regions of Germany for the last 20 years is a stronger predicator of who is going to vote for alternative for Germany than the number of the refugees that come to the regions. So this was the impact of the people that have left. Because at the moment when people start leaving, you basically start to see very fact that you are there and so on as a loss. Loss of perspective, and also don't forget the fact that with the exception of 3 of the Central and East European countries, all of the other Central and East European countries lost population for the last 30 years. In some of the countries, we're talking about dramatic figures. The Baltic countries, my own country. Bulgaria lost around 21% of population since 1989. And if the UN projections are right, until 2040, we're going to lose 27% more. So there is a demographic panic and shrinking, which explains one of the most difficult phenomena of the recent crisis. Why in Central and Eastern Europe you have such a strong anti-migration sentiment in the absence of migrants? Because, and this is a major difference between Austria, for example, and Hungary. You have also some of the anti-migration sentiment in certain parts of the Austrian society. You also have migrants. According to the opinion polls, there are more Hungarians who claim that they have seen unidentified flying objects in their life than those who believe that they have met a migrant. And this fear of the imagined migrant is critically important, basically. But I'm saying this because I do believe in policy terms. One of the things is that if in the beginning of the transition, emigration was perceived as a positive phenomena, not only from the perspective of the individual citizens who is moving and has much more opportunities and is gaining better training and so on, and also, listen, this movement was so natural. Can you imagine Trotsky in 1917 taking a fellowship to go to Oxford? No, because he's staying, he believes that he's in the center of the world, nothing matters. But even Viktor Orban did it. He took a fellowship to go because in a certain way going to the West was totally different. In a certain way, this is what you are trying to do, this is what you're learning, and it was not the state that sent him. I'm saying this because if in the first part of the transition, immigration was perceived as beneficial from the point of view of individuals, but also from the point of view of the governments, because it solved some of the major social problems. And in many of these countries, including my own, basically even today, the remittances coming from the Bulgarians living abroad is the biggest investor in the country. Now immigration started to be perceived as a real existential and political threat. And I'll try to simplify in order basically to make my argument clear. In order to understand the function of a highly nationalistic rhetoric, particularly in the latest elections in Hungary, you should understand that on one level you can build a physical wall on the Hungarian-Serbian border, keeping in mind that Serbia is outside of the EU, but you cannot build a wall on the Austrian-Hungarian border, because basically all your economic development is based on this. But on the same time, many of East European governments face the problem which GDR faced in 1961 when they built the wall. And this is the fear of people living. In the last 8 years, during in the last Hungarian government, more people has left Hungary than after 1956. This is not for political reasons, by the way. This is not the people running because they don't like. I don't want, because it will be unfair, and this is a speculation. It was a major crisis and so on. But I'm saying the following: you have highly ethnically homogeneous societies with a very strong trend, some of the younger population to leave, because for these people there is no major reasons to stay in. In 1982, during the martial law in Poland, when General Jaruzelski basically arrested thousands of people, at some point he basically suggested to the leaders of the Polish opposition that he's going to release them if they decide to leave the country. And then basically Michnik wrote a piece, Why We Are Not Emigrating. And the idea was, if we're going to emigrate, we're going to send an example. We're going to be perceived as non-patriotic. We are going basically to betray the trust which the solidarity people put in us. So leaving the country was perceived as the highest level of disloyalty. So these people decided to stay in jail, but not to emigrate. After 1989, this type of a loyalty issue was not there anymore. Going abroad is not perceived as some type of a radical change. You're ready, you're living, you can come back. You're living, but at the same time you're consuming informationally your own culture because of internet and so on. In a certain way, the exit stopped to be perceived as something which is very radical and critically important. I'm saying this because if you see also in the way my talk was announced, I'm playing with the title, the famous title of Hirschman's Exit, Voice and Loyalty. In front of this audience, I'm not going to repeat basically Hirschman's major argument. But while he's developing quite a lot on exit and voice, Hirschman is not writing much more on loyalty, because for him loyalty was taken for granted. And loyalty is different than trust. Loyalty is something that stops you to take an exit option, even when you have the availability to do it. And he said, it's not easy to leave your country. It's not easy to divorce your husband or wife. It's not easy to basically exit your religion. What I'm saying is that we're living in a period in which all these three things are easy. Do you know what is the number of the Americans who changed their confessions in their lifetime? 40%. They're moving normally from one Christian confession to the other, 40%. Secondly, basically, what is the number of divorces? We're not commenting. And also, from this point of view, emigration lost this kind of important feeling as kind of a betrayal and so on. As a result of it, governments like the Hungarian governments decided basically to create a view of the world in which the only place where you have kind of a real life, where you can be amongst your own, is to stay in your own country. Because in your country, there are only people like you. The difference, for example, in the problem with migration in places like Germany and Hungary is that if in Germany many people fear that the refugees will not succeed to integrate. In Hungary, many fear that they will succeed. And then you're basically going to pollute. So in a certain way, the only way to prevent people living from east to the west, something that was perceived as the trend in 1989, is to claim that the West does not exist anymore. You believe that you go to the West, to Berlin, to Vienna, but in a certain way you go to Istanbul. And from this point of view, this difference between ethnic homogeneity and diversity, and this nationalistic based on rhetoric based on this, is the way to build a kind of an invisible wall that is going to stop people emigrating in the moment in which the labor market is very weak. You have a fear basically of people coming there, and you try to find the competitiveness of all this. How sustainable it is? I don't believe it's sustainable in a long run. I do believe, of course, on a short run it can work, and of course it has electoral effect. But for me, this is very important, and this is my last point is the following. From this point of view, when some of the Central and East European leaders are saying that our countries, particularly Hungary, Poland, can be model for the Western Europe, I do believe that they're wrong. And they're wrong not for the fact that you do not have xenophobic sentiments in Western Europe, that you do not have, for example, strong anti-immigrant sentiments and so on. I do believe there is a major cultural shift from rights of the majority to the rights of the minority to the rights of the majority all over Europe, and we're going to see basically transformation of Western democracies too. But East European model of illiberal democracy is based on preventing ethnic diversity and cultural diversity. In Western Europe, it cannot work because ethnic and cultural diversity is a reality. The problem is how to manage it. And here to end up is just to give you one figure. The number of foreigners, the number of citizens of Hungary who have been born out of Hungary is around 4%. And most of them are Hungarians being born in Romania. In Austria, this figure is 16%. And also, you know the number of the people in the schools in Vienna whose first language is not German, starting with my own kids. I'm saying this because from this point of view, one of the major stories when we're trying to see how to rebalance the relations between East and West and try to figure out the relations between liberal and illiberal is that East and West at the moment are facing two different types of problems. And one of the problems of the East is very much the exodus of people. It is very much about immigration. It's not very much about simply migration. And how politically this can be arranged, of course, is going to be a very difficult problem. But I do believe it's very important to try to understand what is the policy questions that governments try to solve when they're doing this or that. Otherwise, we're going to end up simply criminalizing the intentions of certain personalities and even never going to understand the rationale of what they're doing. So thank you very much for your patience. Thank you.